Without any opposition, the galactic predators had been capturing the worlds and stealing what they desired. They considered themselves to be the unrivaled pinnacle of evolution, and unstoppable Earth was just another target. Anticipated to easily subdue these creatures with their sophisticated armor and weaponry, had come across innumerable alien races, all of whom were weaker and less equipped than Earth. Its tiny, frail residents and apparently helpless species were nearly as they hovered in orbit. Their leader spoke to the crew, describing their species in a contemptuous manner that they found laughable. With contempt, he displayed to them pictures of tiny winged insects that were crawling and buzzing. The crew burst out laughing as they made fun of the little Earth defenders. One of them, Jared, pointing at the screen, couldn't believe they were given such a mission. Is this a joke? Taking on the minuscule appearance of an ant, these organisms wouldn't even be aware of our presence until we've grabbed everything. The group prepared to descend to Earth with smug assurance, thinking they would complete this mission without breaking perspiration and hardly recognizing the animals below as anything more than an annoyance in the area where their ships landed. They believed would be teeming with life in the middle of a dense rainforest, but the commander said there was no actual threat. Walked out first, trampling the foliage beneath him with his hefty armored boots. The team followed each other. With a mixture of delight and disdain, they started to explore the wonders of this lush, green world. Tearing through shrubs and vines in the woodland, trampling on plants as they went. They ignored the life around them, believing it to be inconsequential and hardly deserving of concern. One of them saw, "These are Earth's mighty warriors," he hissed, treading on a line of ants that were smirking as they crawled across a log. As he scooped up an ant between his fingers, a second predator joined him without hesitation, laughing. Examining it with a mixture of interest and derision, he looks at how little and frail it is. Apparently unfazed, the ant flicked it away and fell back to the earth. As continued on its journey, the predators chuckled once more, their voices resonating through the woods they were accustomed to hearing. Planets with armies and fortifications were repelled by other worlds, yet it appeared nothing was there save for small animals scuttling about, unaware of the predators above them. These ants weren't your typical insects, they were bullet ants, which are well known around the world for their deadly sting. Their colony and area, and any encroachment would not be tolerated because As the predators advanced farther into the woodland, several ants started to pay attention. Above the strange smell of these invaders, they could sense the vibrations of heavy footsteps drifting down to slowly, their impulses began to overwhelm them, prompting them to look in to safeguard their house as the predators carried on exploring without realizing they had already roused the initial indications of opposition. They went past shrubs and trees, their senses only alerted to more serious dangers. One of I expected more as the crew members laughed and kicked at the ground where another line of ants was marching steadily. Whispered, "Where's the challenge?" partially to himself and half to his friends. Failed to detect the lone gunshot, and desperate to protect its territory, it clambered onto his foot and discovered a tiny opening in the armor that is just large enough to fit through with precision out of impulse. The ant grabbed hold and stung, and the predator immediately felt a searing agony that rushed through. He stumbled back in surprise, yelping through his foot. What was that? His fellow predators looked at him in bewilderment as he mumbled, glancing down at his foot. I was laughing so hard at his response. Did one of those ants really bite you? The afflicted predator gritted his teeth, obviously not taking the taunt seriously. He had experienced agony in the past, but this time it was different, and a powerful, pulsing sensation that appeared to waver through his body. He was able to dismiss their amusement by saying, "Just an insect," but the pain remained more acute than he had expected. He attempted to ignore it, but it nodded at him. He could not believe how the discomfort increased with every second that went by. It didn't make logical that a tiny creature could cause so much suffering, so he took taking a big breath in an attempt to stabilize himself, but the pain only got worse. It seemed like he lost his balance again, as the sting set off a more severe, raw, burning pain that went through his entire thigh. As he faltered, his friends saw that their amusement was waning due to the gravity of his battle. When one of them questioned, the predator frowned and looked up, his face twisted and unable to adequately describe the pain. He mumbled, gripping his leg, "It feels like fire. Is not your typical bite." The others looked at each other, and there was a glimmer of doubt that they didn't think there would be any actual danger here, but witnessing their friend in such obvious pain prompted they paused, and one of the others shook his head and mocked, saying, "It's just a bug." Demanded, but his tone lacked conviction. The impacted predator now took a few unsteady steps in an attempt to restore his calmness. But he could feel the ache that would not go away. Every pulse that passed through his veins served as a reminder of the substance's strength as he looked down. Scanning the ground where the ants traveled in straight lines, these microscopic organisms moved so effortlessly the other predators observed that being dismissed now had a new, unpleasant meaning. They were no longer amused, but rather quietly uneasy that something so trivial could generate this degree of unease. What else might be concealed in this seemingly innocuous forest as they proceeded farther into the... Some of the other predators started to move more cautiously in the bush, their bluster tempered by increasing fatigue. They had anticipated a simple conquest, but this brief interaction suggested something else. Couldn't fully get how the leader's observations of his crew's responses motivated them to proceed and concentrate on their purpose, but even he sensed a change in the air and an unseen tension that persisted with every stride. They sensed that the unknown was encroaching on them and that Earth was no longer only a primitive, helpless planet. There were secrets and dangers in this realm that didn't fit into their neat knowing strength and frailty. They had made fun of Earth's species and scoffed at its insects. Yet when they additionally, a seed of doubt started to germinate. What if they had underestimated? They wouldn't have to wait long to discover the bullet ants. But what if there was more to this world than first meets the eye? Now that they were aware of the disruption, more people were congregating, their instincts pushing them to protect their home, and the predators continued their journey without seeing the swarm rising behind them. They were going to discover that the tiniest defense errors on Earth had power far greater than their thus. The predators continued without being confronted with their friend's response to the ant sting, which to them was only a small irritation. A peculiar but unmemorable event on what they thought would be an otherwise simple conquest. They moved farther into the thick forest, their footsteps resonating as they trampled over the vegetation and disturbed the earth. They had the most cutting-edge armor made to shield them from strong weaponry, and animals that actually threatened them were not a problem for Earth's wildlife. As they proceeded, a few ants stuck to the sides of their boots, animals they hardly thought were worth observing. It was a minor detail that went undetected, and none of them even considered checking after every ability and piece of technology they possessed was put to the test as they battled through worlds with defenses. They had no expectations other than simplicity. They were more interested in the riches that Earth had to offer than in the actual creatures. One predator made a joke about Earth's mighty and laughed off the previous sting, determined to ignore the waning pain. Defenders rejected the idea that these animals could hurt them, and the others joined in making fun of the concept of a planet protected by tiny animals and insects. They didn't understand what Earth was. Biodiversity, or the adaptability its species had acquired to endure over millennia, assuming size and strength. Equal strength without understanding the complexities of Earth's natural defenses. But as they regrouped the disruption in their colony, ants resumed their stealthy response, traveling in deliberate waves. Colony had activated a natural defense mechanism that had been refined over time. Because the predators misjudged this instinct, the ants dispersed and created well-organized trails in the direction of their intruders. These invaders weren't big or obviously menacing, but when their numbers increased and their intentions became apparent, they were a direct danger to their house. One of the predators halted suddenly and swore as he felt a searing pain on his thigh. Thinking it was merely a sting or irritation, he swatted at his armor, but as if something were digging into his skin, the pain continued to intensify. He had never experienced such an odd feeling that would not go away. He saw some ants sticking to the openings in his armor. As he looked down, he brushed them away, but the discomfort persisted. And he felt a glimmer of doubt as another predator saw him trying, smiled, and shrugged off. He smirked and described the incidents as a simple vulnerability, like a bug. But as they moved, more ants entered the battle. Some of them squeezing through tiny openings in their armor to find the smallest vulnerabilities. The ants' movements were so accurate that it seemed like they knew exactly where to strike to inflict the most pain. Predators saw that every stride seemed to intensify the sting they were trying to avoid. Disregard it. They were too proud to admit the impact of such tiny beings, yet the suffering was over. Merely a small irritation, it had spread sharply and pulsatingly, penetrating deeply into. For the first time, they experienced a peculiar weakness in their legs that they were unable to fully describe. Saw how many ants had clung to them and brushed at their legs in an attempt to remove them as they started to glance down. Each sting was a purposeful act of defense by the ants, yet the insects held firm. Had come across other beings on different planets, But none had behaved so resolutely or generated such intense heat. The ants had discovered a new source of pain, which started to unnerve them. Waves of rhythmic onslaught caused the predators to suffer from a persistent, unbearable pain. Attempted to continue despite the pain, but their pace had slowed and their confidence faltered. Reached muscles they couldn't ignore as it crawled up their legs, surprising them with its intensity and the quiet when the commander noticed his crew's uncertainty. The invisible force of the ants started to feel like a real menace, and he barked at them to keep going. He refused to admit that he or his crew were weak, yet even he experienced the pain, and the ants' well-planned onslaught was a strange and unwanted reminder that they were not invincible. Seeking vulnerable spots and taking advantage of any armor defect, it seemed as though these animals were skilled at inflicting pain and gradually wearing down their larger adversaries. The stinging heat was seen by predators as an obstacle to the ants rather than merely a bother. Unrelenting assault started to interfere with their concentration, eroding their resolve, and they could sense their strength ebbing, a gradual erosion that weakened their self-esteem, the laughter that had been there before giving way to silent cursing and irritated attempts to remove the ants. As each step grew more difficult and the agony more intense, they began to. Some attempted to flee as their pride and haughtiness gave way to frustration, but discovered that additional ants were blocking their way, seemingly anticipating every move they made. It was a silent fight that occurred without the predator's knowledge, yet it had a greater effect than any weapon they had encountered before realizing one predator proposed retraction of a concept that would have been ridiculed for minutes due to the ants' persistence. Previously, but now when they were confronted with this unexpected force. They weren't so undoubtedly. The leader hated acknowledging that something so trivial could alienate people, but even he could sense the predators had come unprepared for the toll, the persistent stinging that would not go away. Anticipating a straightforward conquest and an immediate triumph over a helpless Earth, but Earth's species, even the tiniest, there was a power among them that they hadn't considered, and every action served as a reminder of their failure. Acknowledgement that they had misjudged this planet, and as the ants persisted in their attack, the predators started to sense the weight of their conceit. The suffering became more than just bodily, it was a blow to their pride, a humiliating power that made them admit their own weakness. The tiny, and despite their seeming insignificance, they had turned out to be more than a bother. Defenders and guardians of their realm, they engaged in combat with a determination that equaled that of the most highly developed armies. The predators struggled against the increasing discomfort in their armor as they staggered backwards with each stride. The ants demonstrated an unrelenting power that was incomparable to their technology and strength. They possessed a distinct kind of power that was based on unity, perseverance, and an unwavering sense of purpose rather than bulk or strength. The predators had come to conquer with a goal, but now that they felt the full power of the ants' attack, they started to realize how serious their error was. The predators were unable to ignore the constant agony that was shooting through their bodies. Each stride they took felt like anything that was once a small irritation turned into an unforgiving force as the bullet ants stepped up their attack. That neither armor nor cutting-edge technology could stop the crew from facing up against a force of well-trained troops or strong weapons, but something much more primordial, surprising, and well-planned. Each predator experienced the excruciating anguish of a swarm of seemingly inconsequential insects. As though hundreds of small burns were spreading across their flesh through their legs, the swarm's well-coordinated assault had the ants marched like a well-trained battalion, aiming for every exposed gap and taking advantage of them with an unsettling precision. Flaws in the armor and stinging with relentless precision, each causing a new surge of agony. Their superior size and power had no effect on the predators, leaving them confused and unable to think effectively. Worth here is not in opposition to these silent but vicious forest defenders, for the desperation infiltrated the aliens' first experience of dread, a feeling they hardly ever experienced during their conquests. Even the most resolute of them attempted to brush the ants from their minds, but each swipe proved fruitless. They simply appeared to encourage further ants to ascend higher and disperse farther. It was as though the swarm recognized that each ant strikes its prey in coordination with the others, increasing the pain and stinging severity, causing several predators to falter as their legs buckled under the sudden attack. Expressions that were once assured became vapors of anguish and annoyance as their leader struggled to keep the peace. Ordered the group to continue pushing forward, but his voice lacked the conviction it had possessed, and the morale of the company was eroding. and the leader himself could feel the sharp stinging getting stronger every second. He wanted to continue the display of fortitude to encourage his crew to endure the discomfort, but the ants were unforgiving, and it was obvious that these little animals had no desire to flee. And predators accustomed to easy wins had no experience against a tiny but incredibly powerful adversary. The constant ache was worse than anything they had experienced in combat, which their advanced armor was meant to endure. Strong weapons, but it didn't do much to stop the ants' tiny bodies from slipping through cracks and stinging. The technology they depended on to safeguard their delicate skin had let them down, and their self-esteem was being undermined by every bite. The agony was coupled with an odd feeling of powerlessness. Completely alien to them, they were unable to successfully defend themselves against such tiny animals, and they could plan against an adversary that relied on instinct rather than reasoning would have useless weaponry and training. It didn't matter, the ants were everywhere, an unavoidable force that seemed to grow stronger every second. Discovered that their prior boldness had been totally surpassed by panic and hesitancy in their attempts to withdraw. Descended into mayhem as the swarm relentlessly pursued each. When a predator attempted to escape, the sting would only get worse if the ants sensed their fear and pressed their assault more forcefully. Some predators started to lash out, flailing their arms wildly and legs in a furious attempt to push the ants away, but it only appeared to make them angrier as they clung more tightly. Their rapid succession of stings caused pain spikes that left the predators breathless and forced them to proceed, stumbling more into the jungle, their strained, uneven steps disturbed by the ants' formation. Leaving the predators dispersed and separated from one another, they were no longer a unified group. People who were all struggling with excruciating agony that impairs their judgment and depletes their strength, unable to concentrate on their task, and couldn't look past the immediate agony that engulfed them in a last-ditch effort to reconvene. One predator proposed requesting reinforcements, but the commander rejected the suggestion, asking how they could acknowledge. When they were pushed to the limit by a swarm of insects, it was an unimaginable blow to their pride that none of them desired to admit, but each predator knew in their heart that they were losing control, that the forest had been transformed into a battlefield by the ants, for which they were ill-prepared. Predators could hardly move, much less take down every tree and shrub. Appeared to conceal a second line of ants poised to join the assault, using the predator's standard methods of raw force, and in the end, intimidation was ineffective because they were a territory where their superior strength and sophisticated technology were meaningless because the ants owned the forest and they battled for it. As the pain increased, some predators dropped to their knees, gripping, with a determination that was both humiliating and horrifying. Their legs, their mouths contorted in pain. They had anticipated encountering a feeble and helpless world, but in actuality, things were very different. The ants, despite their diminutive size, had shown to be strong opponents. They weren't just pets, they were protectors, and winning when the crew understood how serious their situation was, and that they were being forced back, panic broke out. Compelled to admit that Earth was not as helpless as they had believed, the ants had demonstrated that these little creatures' power was measured by more than just their size and strength. The predators found it difficult to comprehend how acting with cohesion and purpose had brought them to their knees. They were supposed to be invincible world conquerors, but they had made a grave calculation error, and now they were the forest felt oppressive, with the trees and vegetation feeling overpowered by creatures so little that they couldn't even be seen. Every rustle and movement seemed to compound their terror and discomfort, as if clothes were all about them. Their goal had changed from a regular conquest to a frantic one, with another wave of ants ready to attack. They were no longer making progress in their fight for existence. Instead, they were only attempting to flee after the ants had driven them to a point in their lives where they had never felt truly vulnerable. And as they staggered through the woodland, they were departed with the sobering knowledge that they had misjudged Earth and that it had cost them dearly. The ants carried on with an unwavering resolve. They relentlessly pursue their small bodies as they surge forward. Driven by a single goal that the predators could not understand, the group dispersed, and they never stopped. And weak, they could only keep going in the hopes of escaping the nightmare they had entered, which had begun as laughter at Earth's feeble species had evolved into a struggle for existence. The ants had shown themselves to be the real guardians of the forest, a force that they were losing with every excruciating sting. The aliens were something the predators had not expected and would soon forget. Lurched farther into the jungle, the pain getting worse with each step as the ants' relentless attack persisted. changed from a stinging annoyance to a burning agony that interfered with their mobility and cognitive function. It was no longer enough to just ignore the ants or hope they would disappear. Each predator felt as though their body had transformed into a battlefield with throbbing pain and waves of heat that were impossible to ignore, their typical resolve. And as they tried to reorganize the group, their pride had waned and been replaced with the sobering awareness that they were no longer in control. Ants showed no mercy, swarming every exposed spot and moving higher up their bodies to take advantage of every weakness. Having never encountered anything like this before, Predator's sophisticated armor and technology felt ineffective against such a tiny but concentrated force. Every mouthful appeared to intensify the previous one, producing a cumulative effect that exceeded their training. And they were suddenly struck with the knowledge that desperation caused them to try various strategies while fighting a losing battle. Yet some attempted to escape back through the road they came in the hopes that the ants wouldn't follow, but nothing seemed to work. The intensity of the swarm only grew, as though the ants were familiar with every inch of the woodland and had become adept at cornering them. The predators' typical tactic of forcing their will on weaker species turned out to be, instead of fleeing, they were stranded here, surrounded by worthless and adversary they were unable to outmaneuver, and exhaustion began to erode what strength remained in their bulky armor. The source of pride now seemed like a jail, intensifying the heat and enclosing them in a shell that made it difficult for them to move around. Attempts to modify or take off their equipment just provided the ants with additional entry sites, which they immediately took advantage of. The sting's pain was unlike anything they had ever experienced, causing a dizziness that made everything decision feel slow and unfinished. And the group leader is having trouble keep everything under control while observing his squad struggle when they realized that their unity was breaking apart and that some predators they stumbled because they could no longer endure the unrelenting agony and had given up on keeping the peace. Fighting mindlessly against the ants, the formerly orderly group of conquerors' movements were wild and unfocused, become a dispersed, helpless group of people, each attempting to live its own life. And internal conflicts increased. Some predators, incensed by their leader's persistence on continuing, started to publicly challenge his choices. Loyalty weakening as the agony persisted, the customary order and hierarchy they depended on in combat had disintegrated, giving way to chaos, and they stopped considering their objective or the resources. They asserted that the sole goal at this point was survival efforts. The ants' persistent presence interfered with their communication systems, making it impossible to ask for reinforcements, even if assistance were to arrive. The team was aware in their hearts that they wouldn't be able to disclose the actual nature of their defeat. How could the galaxy's most fearsome predators acknowledge that creatures had brought them to their knees? Even though they were tiny as ants, the notion weighed hard on each of them, adding to the stress and annoyance. In some predators started to fall as their energy ran out, unable to endure the unrelenting attack any longer. The ants swarmed over them and turned each fallen. The psychological effects of turning the predator into a live reminder of the force they confronted were felt by those who were still standing. Of witnessing their allies fall, the hitherto unimaginable possibility that they might not survive started to become plausible. Potential that the forest, which had appeared so benign when they first came, suddenly felt oppressive, as if it were actively. The ants appeared to be aware of every move they made, acting against them and anticipating their attempts to flee or reassemble. It seemed as if the forest itself had turned against the predators, continually changing to suit their needs. Their years of experience and advanced training felt pointless here, as they used the ants as their weapon. The strategy they had previously used failed in the face of the relentless assault. They were taught to combat organized armies, not a swarm of relentless, almost undetectable adversaries that knew no rules, and that the ants were relentless and showed no symptoms of fatigue in a different type of battle for which they had not prepared, reluctance or fear. Their sole goal seems to be to completely expel these intruders from the crew's spirit. Already frightened, the once proud predators who had made fun of the ants were now reduced to battling for their lives. Even the strongest of them felt the pressure of this conflict weighing down on them, shattering their determination. But to acknowledge that their superiority meant nothing in this situation. They were just unwanted intruders and overpowered by a force that didn't give a damn about their reputation or technology. Some predators collapsed to their knees, gripping their armor in an attempt to escape the unbearable agony, while others gazed in awe, unable to understand how they had been so completely overpowered by the knowledge of their vulnerability. Struck hard, and nothing spared them, not even their armor, stature, or pride. They were nothing more than prey in this forest with these beasts, and their leader was once the personification of. Without any remaining strategy or words of assurance, confidence and control were lacking. Could only watch helplessly as his men was robbed of their strength and dignity. He recognized the ants had demonstrated that there was no longer any victory to be gained here. That some fortifications were beyond the capabilities of technology and brutal force, and that some conflicts couldn't be won by pure force alone. The predators had arrived on Earth with the intention of easily conquering and dominating, but instead they found themselves they were brought to a condition of terror and desperation once the ants demonstrated the boundaries of their power. Truth that they had long disregarded, which is that ant persistence and solidarity may triumph against haughtiness and might. With their mission of failure, the predators' unwavering defense revealed a force considerably larger than anything they had ever encountered. The only thing the surviving predators could do was to make it out of the forest, which was no longer a safe place to be. Defeated, but a location to be feared and revered since the ants had taught them that some areas were better left alone. Some creatures should not be disturbed. Their pride has brought them here, yet the only way to how they might abandon the predators, who were previously bold and unafraid, and have since gone through the fore. The goal has long since been replaced by a wilderness with only one way out. By a valiant attempt to escape the relentless attack of Earth's tiny relentless defenders. Their armament seemed like a burden enclosing heat and intensifying the suffering of being their defense, an emblem of dominance. With the swarm of ants chasing them, every sting and stride turned into an agony. Without hesitation, the woodland becomes a hostile environment rather than merely an unfamiliar one. Each predator felt the weight of defeat in their bones as they realized they had no right to take that territory. Had been degraded beyond redemption, and the predator's initial sense of supremacy had changed to resignation. Worn out and bruised, no longer concerned with pride or keeping their cool, their thoughts were just concentrated on by the time they arrived at their ship, a safe haven apart from these animals. Ants had come to represent Earth. Surprising power, a force that needed just perseverance and unity, no weapons or sophisticated tactics. The crew found it difficult to understand how their technological accomplishments had led them to this point. Every procedure and strength test had been completely failed by their source of pride. As they staggered forward, the thing they relied on shattered before the relentless attack of a monster they had considered inconsequential. Some predators, who had previously been the most agile, started to lag, moving more slowly and breathing more heavily. Having been outspoken about their contempt for the inhabitants of Earth, they now found it difficult to move due to weariness and agony from the stings. Had left a lasting scar that appeared to get worse every time the leader who had forced them to continue moving forward, finding it difficult to move himself as his strength diminished and there was no longer any sense of control or authority because their spirit had been broken. Had lost the forest, which was formerly an area they hardly knew, in every manner that mattered. Observed that they were now alive with a force that worked against them, it seemed as though the environment as a whole had risen to repel, unwavering in their purpose. The ants persisted in their relentless pursuit. Typically, predators use technology, intimidation, and hard force. It was sobering to see how helpless they were against the creatures they previously laughed at. Insight that severely highlighted each predator's susceptibility to the group's disarray. Shattered each predator, too preoccupied with surviving to think about anything else. They were no longer a team because of the cohesiveness and unity they took pride in. However, each person was fighting the swarm in their own unique way, and some had already lost to the others, struggled aimlessly through the undergrowth, their vision impaired by constant stinging and tiredness. Their movements were hazy due to pain, and even their most sophisticated instruments couldn't save them now. Their battle to stay alive and breathe took up all of their remaining concentration as the crew approached the forest's edge. They briefly felt relieved that the ship was finally visible. When they were eventually able to flee, yet even this minor triumph was marred by their pain and humiliation. They had arrived expecting to conquer, but instead encountered opposition and suffering, each sting serving as a reminder of that this world had defenders ready to battle to the death, and that the ants had made it obvious that they were not welcome. Desperation was evident in the crew's last steps as they boarded their ship. As they staggered onto the entry ramp and gasped as the door closed behind them, the ship's silence was palpable. Alien after they passed out in the jungle due to the constant pain and loudness. The leader, still reeling from the experience, gazed around at their bodies in broken pride as they struggled to regain their breath. His vanquished crew understood each other without the need for words. They had miscalculated Earth's defenses and creatures, Supposing that be an easy victory had been a bitter lesson in humility, and the forest view loomed as they powered up the ship. Outside of Serene and left the predators, who before thought saw themselves as the forest was now viewed by Invincible as something far more powerful. They had lost to creatures smaller than a small portion of their size, without armor and weapons but possessing a strong determination to protect their home at that very moment. They realized they would never set foot on this Earth again. Following their ordeal, the Kree set out to depart from Earth, each of them carrying a recollection of their meeting. Through their experience with the ants, they had acquired a lifelong lesson: genuine strength isn't always evident or clear, that it can take on forms they had not previously thought of as they left Earth behind, feeling both humbled and ashamed by the tenacity of these small animals who each predator sat in silence, thinking about how they had protected their world without fear. The trip home would be a moment to accept what had transpired in order to make amends for the loss they would never forget. Feeling of how, despite their superior technology and strength, they had undervalued such a world and were outperformed by something they hardly comprehended, and even though they were able to leave Earth's defenders' memory alive, those persistent ants would serve as a constant reminder to them that there are several types of strength and that conceit can be a fatal vulnerability.